Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the William Bonney Weekly Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me again. This is the podcast where we have a look at what's going on in the news, things that have taken my interest, and what's going on in the world of William Bonney and his ever procrastinating podcasts. So let's get stuck in. Like I say, thank you very much for taking the time to come and listen to me again today. Today we are going to have a look at the lady that we have made a couple of videos about before, the UK's worst nurse, the one you're most likely to not leave your children with, especially newborns. Lucy Letby's story is unlike anything we've seen before. Back in August 2023, she was found guilty of murdering 7 infants and attempting to murder 6 others at the Countess of Chester Hospital's neonatal unit between 2015 and 16. This verdict made her one of the most prolific child killers in the UK history. Letby received a whole life order, one of the very few prisoners in the UK that's received a whole life order, essentially meaning that she'll never be released from prison. However, her legal team have been fiercely contesting the verdict, and her appeal was heard earlier on this week. The prosecution painted a disturbing picture during the trial. Letby, they argued, wasn't a clumsy caregiver. She was a deliberate and calculating perpetrator. Evidence suggested that she used various methods to harm babies, including injecting air into their bloodstreams, sabotaging oxygen supplies, and even administering unnecessary medication. These actions allegedly led to the tragic deaths of 7 infants and placed the lives of 6 others in grave danger. What made the case even more unsettling was the sheer number of victims and the nature of the crimes. Letby was a trusted healthcare professional, someone parents entrusted with the well-being of their most vulnerable loved ones. The idea that she might be responsible for such harm was deeply disturbing. The trial itself, lasting a staggering 10 months, became the longest murder trial in British history. The public was captivated by the gruesome details and the sheer number of alleged incidents. Letby's initial attempt to appeal the verdict was rejected back in January 2024. However, her legal team has not given up. They are currently arguing the case before 3 judges at an appeal court in London. Now, that went ahead, and the results came back on May 24th, 2024. The panel of 3 judges at the Court of Appeal in London delivered their verdict on Letby's renewed application. In a very brief hearing, the Court of Appeal judges rejected Letby's appeal on all grounds. They offered no specific reasoning for their decision, but a full judgment will be released in due course. This means that Letby's original convictions for murder and attempted murder stand. While this is a significant setback for Letby's defence, it doesn't necessarily mark the end of the legal process. There is a possibility her lawyers could further explore her options, although the details remain unclear. It's very difficult to know where else she's got to go now. So the appeal process is in 2 parts, really. The first part is you get heard by 1 judge, and the two things that you would appeal on what are the length of the sentence. You would argue, if you were her lawyers, that the sentence was unnecessarily long, and with it being the whole of her life, you've got plenty of room to argue that it's unnecessarily long there. And also maybe any parts of the case that weren't covered properly. So if you felt like there was some evidence that wasn't listened to, or a part of the case that was ignored that should have been given more weight, then you could maybe throw some weight behind that as your appeal. But it's been rejected. So whatever grounds she used, whether it be length of sentence or evidence that wasn't used, then it's been rejected, and she's never going to get out. There is no more appeal process for her. The only time that she could actually do any kind of appeal now against her sentence would be if any new evidence came to light. So, but with the nature of her case, the nature of her case was that a lot of the time she was left on her own with babies, and they were dying, and there was no there was no real kind of evidence of, blood tests. Nobody noticed that she was doing the killings at the time, so there was no postmortems on the kids. So it's unlikely that there's going to be any new forensic evidence coming forward, because there was very little forensic evidence to start with. There's no CCTV. It's all very, 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 very shady and dark. I didn't actually believe that she did it. I was on the fence for a long time, and then kind of leaned towards the fact that she didn't do it. But I think that was just because of I think it's easier for me to look at somebody like that and think, see the nicer side of them, because as I mentioned before, she was like, Lucy Letby looked like one of the girls, those kind of plain Jane girls that would go for me when I was a young crook. They would find me being flirting with the law very exciting, and those kind of plain Jane, ordinary, nice girls were my bread and butter when I was a younger lad. So yeah, I think I found it very difficult to believe that she could actually do that. But it's just one of those things. I spoke to a doctor about it recently, and he even said to me that Munchausen syndrome is very difficult. It's very difficult to be around and explain, because they can do some very nasty things with very little reasoning behind it. So it does look like the most likely scenario is that Letby will remain behind bars, serving her whole life sentence. The appeal rejection doesn't provide answers to the specific grounds of the Letby's teams presented. We may have to wait for the full judgment from the Court of Appeal to understand the reasoning behind their decision. Essentially, she's got a retrial coming up in November, I believe, for one of the cases that the jury couldn't quite make a decision on, so they're going to retrial that one. It's difficult for the judges to kind of come out with any definite information, because if they come out saying that she is 100% bang to rights, she definitely did all these, that could taint the trial that's coming up. And in the same way as well, if they came out saying that there's some real holes in this and that it should be retrialed, that also could make her look a bit more innocent and affect the trial coming up in future. So I can understand why the judges have been so guarded on their judgment, but it'd be interesting to see what the rest of it comes out. The Letby case continues to raise critical questions about the hospital safety protocols, the ability to detect potential harm to vulnerable patients, and the impact that such cases have on the nursing profession. While some may feel a sense of closure with the appeal being denied, others may grapple with the unanswered questions and concerns about the details of the case. Now, you only have to look into the comment section of any Lucy Letby video, and it's a war zone. There's plenty of people in there still defending her to this day, and there's also lots of people out there who think she's absolutely guilty. So, interesting. What do you think? The Letby case remains to be a complex and disturbing one. While the appeal has been denied, it undoubtedly has left a lasting impact. This case will likely continue to spark debate and raise important questions about trust, safety, and the justice system. Because there was lots of times during that case where she could have been caught and found out, but also it was swinging the other way as well, as in the bosses at the hospital got doctors to apologise to Lucy Letby at one point because they felt like they were harassing her for no reason. So, So how do we think Lucy's taken this now? So a lot of people listen to these videos because it's I have the criminal insight, and I've got the insight from being in prison for all these years. So how would that have gone for Lucy? So Lucy would have known through her lawyers and obviously the process and everything, her personal officer, that what was happening outside of prison was happening. She would have definitely been in the loop. She would have known that the first appeal had been rejected. She would have got a letter come through from her solicitor, or she would have got a phone call from them. Her personal officer would have came down. They don't like to deliver bad news in prison too sort of harshly. So a lot of the time, the bad news is kind of managed, especially with prisoners like Lucy, who, even though the nature of her crimes would make her quite a heinous criminal, she's still viewed as a vulnerable prisoner because anything like this could tip her over to the edge. All right, she'll be on suicide watch right now. Her personal officer would have brought down the letter, and they would have explained to her that the appeal process has been rejected the first time. And her solicitor would have then come with her with the options and said, right, we're going to take it to the High Court. We're going to try and get the 3 judges to overturn this and have a look at it again. They would have said to her, we've got nothing to lose. We might as well go for it. It would have been difficult to not put all your eggs in this basket. And can you even imagine if she is innocent? Can you even imagine? She's only in her 30s now, and she's got to spend the next 40, 50 years in prison. And there's none of this kind of, getting ill, being an ill old lady and being let out. She's definitely going to spend the rest of her days in prison. When she becomes an ill old lady, she will die in a hospital wing in prison. So for the appeal process, like I say, she would have known it's happening. She would have got confirmation from her lawyers and her personal officer that appeal has been rejected. They would have come to her. They would have said, it's been rejected. I'm sorry. There's nowhere else you can go from this now. And that would have hit you like a ton of bricks. Most of my sentences were between sort of 2 and 3 years long. So, I was always getting bad news, but it was never anything like this. And even just imagining facing 2 and 3 years in prison is a long time. It's only short relatively. The pandemic seems like it was fairly recent, doesn't it? And that was 4 years ago now. So essentially that was an 8-year sentence ago. So if you got sentenced to 8 years in 2020, you're out now. So it's, it feels like a long time, but relatively it is pretty quick, and it does fly by, insanely quickly. So Letby would be absolutely devastated. They would put her back on suicide watch. If she'd come off it, she'd be back on suicide watch now, and she would be having people making sure that she doesn't kill herself, because as an inmate, as a human being, it's pretty helpless. You're in a pretty helpless situation right now. So she would be looking to just end it all. What's the point in doing 40 years in prison when you can just end it all now with a razor blade? So that's definitely what the officers will be looking to do, and they'll be nice. They're not going to be being really harsh to her. The inmates will be. Other inmates, because she'll probably be on the hospital wing, so she'll have limited access to other inmates. But there will be inmates on that wing who know who she is, and they'll be shouting out the windows at her. They'll be shouting things like "baby killer," "beast." They'll be pushing her to kill herself. They'll be pushing her to hang herself or do self-harm to herself. Those inmates will be being pretty rotten to her right now. It's going to be a pretty lonely place for Letby to be. I know her family moved closer to the prison. She's in Bronzefield right now, so I know her family moved closer to the prison. She's maybe getting regular visits, but it's going to be a pretty lonely existence for her right now. If she has put any coping mechanisms together, she'll be hopefully leaning right into them, reading books, watching telly. She may have found God, all of these kind of things. You'd be surprised how many prisoners find God in the build-up to their appeal process or the parole process. God is easy to find in those days. But yeah, so bad news is a really difficult one in prison. It has to be managed by the officers because it can end up pretty bad. You know what? Bad days turn into bad lives if you don't manage bad news properly. So I had plenty of times of getting bad news in jail. Most of it was relationship based. So I was pretty much always in a relationship with a girl when I was banged up. And most of the relationships I saw in prison never lasted more than 6 months. There was only 1 or 2 guys that out of the whole time I was in prison, they were actually still with their partners after any kind of length in prison. But yeah, after about 6 months, it becomes very difficult to sort of stand by your man. So initially, in the first couple of sentences, I tried to make it work, but you inevitably get that bad news letter or phone call saying that they can't do it anymore, or that they've met somebody else, or that the pressure of doing a sentence and trying to manage a relationship in prison is too much. So that awful letter comes explaining why it's over and they don't think it's going to work anymore. And it's always pretty difficult to try and turn them around because that isn't a rash decision that they've made. You know, that your girlfriend on the outside, she's kind of broken up with you over the last couple of weeks. And then that final nail in the coffin is the letter. So once you receive the letter, that's pretty much part and parcel. She's done. So that's a bow put on the breakup. So when you receive that letter in jail and you think, right, I'm going to fight for her, you're already 2 weeks too late. You're not going to fight for her. Any phone calls, you can dodge your phone calls, and you've got to write a letter that's going to take another 2 or 3 days to get back to her. Forget about it. That relationship's done. So that was one of my first experiences of bad news in jail, having to deal with all those breakups. But you get used to it, and part of my normal routine towards the end was, as soon as you get into jail, you might as well break up with them in the court cells, because that relationship is going to end. So let's just get it out of the way, early doors. Other bits of bad news: I've been rejected on parole before. That was pretty rough. So in the old days, anything for a 4-year sentence or above, you used to have to go for parole at halfway. So at the 2-year point, you could try and argue that you qualified for parole and that you should be outside. So you would spend 6 months putting together reports and paperwork and seeing people and dancing through all the little hoops that they put up for you, and you're trying to convince everyone that you're a changed man. The first time I went for parole, I got it. That was fantastic. But then after that, I broke every bit of trust that was ever given to me. So the second time I went for parole, it was a lot more difficult to argue that I wasn't going to get into any more trouble when my criminal record said drastically otherwise. So I got knocked back on my second parole. I was on the good boys wing down at Dartmoor, so I was going out to work and everything, which made it a bit more shocking, because they were telling me that I wasn't trusted to go home, and yet I had been going out to work every day, and I'd been going home on town visits and home leaves and everything else. So they just wanted to keep an eye on me for a bit longer. So the prison officer came to my door, and he said to me, "Bad news, you haven't got your parole. Are you going to be okay with this?" Because on the good boys wing, what they would do, if you got any kind of bad news, is they would what they call gate you. So gate, as in the prison gate, they would gate you. It's a bit like being grounded as a kid. So they would essentially just say to you, right, for this next week, you're not going out. You're a bit emotional at the moment. You just had some bad news. You're not going out for the next week. And they would do that to people if they'd had family problems. So say if like a relative died, or if you'd just been broken up with, or like in my case, you didn't get your parole. I've seen people get gated for breakups before, because you're in an emotional state and you're more likely to do a runner. This lad was from Plymouth. His girlfriend broke up with him, and he was a mopey little wreck on the wing, like crying and just being miserable. So the staff noticed that he was probably going to do a runner, and they gated him. They made him stay in for a week until he'd pulled his head out his ass. One of my other pals, he was looking to get out, and his mum fell out with him and made it really difficult for him to go back to his home area. So he went into a bit of a depression, and they gated him over that. So obviously when I got knocked back on my parole, they came to the door, and they asked me if I was going to be an issue, and if they needed to gate me. They didn't gate me because I was trusted and everything, and I'd been going out to work quite a long time at that point. So they thought I was relatively safe. But yeah, it is gutting getting that news that, you're not going home in 2 months. You got to wait another year. So that was pretty rough. You just got to get on with it, though. Prison is all about just dealing with the knocks. It's a very slow-paced world. It's a bit like, you've got to treat it like a snail. You can't look at each day as a victory. You've got to look at the long game, add all those days up. It's brick by brick building a wall, isn't it? Every day you put one more brick in that process. And at the end of the 2 years, you've got a massive wall that you then escape from. But prison is a great place for teaching you the long game and discipline. And I think being outside has actually ruined me a little bit, because it ruins your discipline, because everything is at your fingertips and you can have whatever you want. I'm an adult. I can go and buy anything I want now. And in prison, it kind of disciplines you, because you are very restricted on a lot of stuff. So yeah, maybe instead of doing national service for young kids, they should put them all in prison for a little bit, just toughen them up. What else? Bad news. Oh, relatives dying. the last bit of bad news I had, and it's one of the biggest regrets. If you listened to the podcast before, you'll know it's one of the biggest regrets I've had from being in prison. Is I miss the death of my grandfather, and he was a lovely guy, and that really did upset me. It upset me for a number of reasons. When I was working in the kitchens at the time at Dartmoor, and the chaplain came in, the priest guy in the prison, and he quite often dishes out bad news like this, because it's, that's what they do. They're good at that. And he came and told me in the kitchens that my granddad had died. I had the afternoon off work to kind of like deal with it, and it kind of it does knock you on your ass. And the most disappointing thing about it was that my uncle and auntie, because at this point I've been in and out of prison so much, I stopped telling my family that, hey, I'm back in prison again. I thought it'd be better for them to just not hear from me rather than to know I'm in prison again. So I didn't tell them. And the depressing thing is that they couldn't find me outside. So they started ringing around the prisons, thinking that he must be there. So that was a bit of a depressor. But, the bad news was still the bad news. You deal with it. It's the same as anything else. You have a really rough patch. It's like ripping a plaster off. You have to get that plaster off, toughen up that calluses, build that scab, and then get on with the rest of your fucking day. All right? Nobody's coming to save you. But Lucy Letby, obviously, she has got nowhere to go. She's got no finish line. There's none of this, like, just get your head down for the next couple of years and see where it goes. There's no working towards a DCAT for her. She may end up in quite a soft prison as life goes on, but she'll never get the taste of freedom that you can kind of work towards and kind of gives you hope. So maybe she's completely undeserving of hope. Maybe this is exactly what she deserves. But yeah, I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are and what you think. All right. Thank you very much for listening. We'll speak to you again very, very soon. I'll have a next podcast up in the next couple of days. Hopefully Wednesday we'll put something else out. All right. I don't normally do this, but I just wanted to shout out one of the listeners who messages me on Instagram. You know who you are. You've been a real support to me over the last couple of weeks, and hopefully I've supported you a little bit as well. It's your birthday on Wednesday, so happy birthday, buddy. Hope things are looking up for you. All right, to everybody else, happy birthday. It's your birthday as well. All right. I will put out another podcast on Wednesday, and look after each other. Thank you very much. Cheers now. Bye-bye.